So, this is a sublime place. Marshland to our left, on a day which is misty. Some distant views, we've been able to see the Dartford Bridge, Thurrock Power Station, over to Rainham Marshes and the intrusive landfill sites over there. And then there's a windmill, a great big wind turbine. So a site that perhaps is not appreciated by most people, but a site that is within the Greenbelt, and a site that is very valuable as Greenbelt.
It's Greenbelt, and it belongs to Lord Stoneham of Droxford's family estate, and as far as I can see, they're interested in developing it, whereas the local council, Bexley, have produced a plan for managing the marshes, which is, I think, keeping it much as it is, but taking it towards being parkland. I may be wrong about that, but do you think that would be a good thing to do?
What is good about this area is it's marshland. It's not parkland, which is entirely different. And it's as marshland that it should be kept and developed, for one of the reasons that we have a green belt, which is one of natural capital. And in respect of flooding, we need to maximise the flood capacity of the River Thames. We know, for example, that the Thames Barrier had a lifetime until 2030, according to the GLC. But recent Environment Agency studies say that it should be replaced by 2070. We need to start thinking now for that replacement. And that means a policy of enlarging the flood capacity of the River Thames.
I believe that you've got the Environment Agency on your side in that. I read that they're interested in telling the owners of the industrial estate we're looking at that the flood barrier is only going to be maintained for a certain time into the future, and after that they'll use Dartford and Crayford marshes as flood storage capacity for the Thames to protect London from flooding, I suppose. Would that have a good or a bad effect on Dartford and Crayford marshes?
The Environment Agency proposals would have a very good effect because it would be retaining the land use as marshland.
And so the consequence of that would be to take the character of the area back towards the Middle Ages. Are there any respects in which the character could also move forward towards the needs and tastes of the 21st century?
Back to the Middle Ages makes us recall that we've just walked past a medieval tithe barn and moated house, which was last occupied in 1935, and that should be kept and retained, and is clearly a marvellous potential as a visitor centre, an interpretation centre for the marshes this side of the Darenth River.
Yes, I mean, the Middle Ages have got a bit of a bad name. You know, the Renaissance took on its name and character from the fact that it was a rebirth of civilization after the long dark period of the Middle Ages. But what I'm increasingly thinking is that there were many great things about the Middle Ages, and so maybe what we need is a rebirth of the Middle Ages rather than of classical culture.
Bede, Jarrow, the glories of Anglo-Saxon England, and common land.
So that's nice that we agree about that. And back to the Middle Ages for Dartford Marshes. But what else could we do to move forward into the 20th century? I would want to do both.
Well, view this as being part of the prescription for London's Green Belt generally.
Well, what is the prescription?
We have various prescriptions, which is part of the problem. The present prescription is largely negative, no development.
Let's put it another way. In looking forward, what needs does our society have, which perhaps they didn't have to the same extent in the medieval period? What environmental objectives should we be aiming for?
Natural capital needs, which can be summed up as breathable air, water, water serving our uses, and biodiversity, all wrapped up in ecological systems.
Great. To what extent could Dartford and Crayford marshes also serve recreational objectives?
That was the landscape architect talking. I do apologise for the existence of this minor profession.
No. I absolutely love the character of Dartford and Crayford marshes as it is, but the character's going to change when we go back to the Middle Ages, and without in any way proposing that the area should become parkland, which I'd be very sad about, I still think that there are leisure time, amenity, recreational objectives that the area could fulfil. Don't you think so?
Yes and no, as with all questions of this nature. My basic argument would be that natural systems should predominate. Therefore it should become tidal marsh, and therefore one should allow the tides to perform their natural function and the land to respond accordingly. Yes, you can allow visitor centres. I proposed a medieval tithe barn as a visitor centre. We're sitting next to the tidal defences for the River Darenth, a very strong in situ concrete hulk of a building from the 1960s, which could easily become a visitor centre, allow public access to the roof, and allow the river crossing here, which currently is closed to the public, to become open to the public. Very little needs to be done to expedite that. So they should be minor changes. There should be changes of interpretation, and they should be changes which don't necessarily cost a lot of money. All you have to do fundamentally, which is what the Environment Agency is proposing, is simply breach the dike defences.
About visitor centres, I'm afraid I don't like them one little bit. I like the coffee and the toilets, but nothing else about them. My idea for what should happen, if you look at a map of this area, I think the first OS map of the marshes is 1801, and it's got a bit of a leaf pattern. I think that your environmental objectives are very good, but I'd also like to see some recreational objectives. And what I've got in mind is that if you look at the first OS map of this area of 1801, it shows a sort of leaf-shaped area with veining, which is actually the drainage canals from the old marsh. And so it's reticulated. And what I'd like to see for the future is most of the area given over to the kind of environmental objective you've described, but also a network of public access walking through it so that people could crisscross the marshes without particularly walking on them, so that they could see all these interesting things without messing them up. Do you think that would work?
It's easy to walk on marshes at low tide. It's quite difficult at high tide, and that you shouldn't aim to do. One needs to live with natural systems. So what you're saying is of interest in relation to recreation. At some point I would like to get back to the more fundamental argument, which is one about natural capital.
So what do you mean by natural capital?
Human survival.
Why do you describe survival as capital?
It's natural capital which enables human survival. And one of the great points about the green belts is precisely that negative point. It's stop development, in consequence of which the population of London, which was about 8.5 million in 1939, is still at 8.5 million. It declined after the war and is now growing again. If we hadn't got the green belt, we would now be a megacity with well over 12 million population. I don't want to be rebuffed.